Have you ever noticed that the moment you start thinking for yourself, truly, unapologetically, the world begins to shift? Conversations become strained. People glance away when you speak your truth. Suddenly, you're no longer relatable. You're too intense, too different, or not like you used to be. But the truth is, you haven't become strange. You've become awake. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "And those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music." That's exactly what happens when your inner world evolves beyond the comfort zones of others. It threatens their illusions. Your clarity disrupts their confusion. Your courage exposes their fear. And that's why a strong mind doesn't just stand out, it unsettles. If you're watching this, chances are you've already felt it. The weight of thinking differently, the silence that follows honesty, the discomfort of no longer fitting in. But here's what no one told you. This tension you feel, it's not a breakdown, it's a breakthrough. This video is for those who are done pretending, done seeking approval, and ready to claim their mind as their own. Because once that shift begins, you can't go back. So the question is, what does it actually take to build a mind that strong? A mind that doesn't just survive discomfort, but transforms it into clarity. A mind that no longer conforms out of fear, but stands firm in its own values, even when it means standing alone. To answer that, we have to go back to someone who understood this better than anyone: Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche wasn't just a philosopher who sat in an ivory tower, pondering abstract theories disconnected from reality. He was far more dangerous than that. He was a radical truth seeker, someone who dove headfirst into the darkness most people spend their lives avoiding. While others looked for answers in tradition, religion, or comfort, Nietzsche stared into the void and asked, "What remains when all illusions are gone?" And in that abyss, he found something few dare to embrace. That real strength, the kind that terrifies people, comes from confronting life in its rawest form. Not through affirmations, not through motivational quotes, but through crisis, through chaos, through collapse. He wrote, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." That wasn't poetic fluff. It was a warning, a blueprint. He was telling us, if you want to create something extraordinary within yourself, you must be willing to face everything you've been taught to fear. Pain, loss, rejection, isolation, these aren't signs of failure. They're signs that something in you is breaking open to grow. Think back for a moment. When did you grow the most? Was it during times of ease? When everything went according to plan? Or was it in the moments you thought you couldn't take another step? When something shattered inside you, and you had no choice but to rebuild? I once met a woman who went through a brutal season of life. Within 6 months, she lost her job, her marriage, and was diagnosed with a chronic illness. But years later, when I asked her what that season meant to her, she said, "That's when I finally met myself." Before the collapse, she was living for others, trying to be liked, to fit in, to meet expectations. After everything fell apart, she started living with a kind of fierce clarity, a calm that didn't need permission. That's the power Nietzsche was pointing to. The self that only emerges when everything false is stripped away. Nietzsche never romanticized suffering. He didn't say pain was noble, or that hardship makes you better by default. What he did say, what he proved through his own life, is that suffering becomes powerful only when you stop running from it, only when you turn and face it head on. Because if you do, you start to become someone who no longer bends to fear, someone who doesn't flinch when the world tries to shame, control, or silence them. You become mentally sovereign. But Nietzsche also gave a warning. Chaos without direction can destroy you. Pain alone doesn't create wisdom. It has to be guided by something deeper, a purpose, a center, a vision. That's why, before transformation can begin, you must ask, what am I building through this? Who am I becoming? Not because the world told me to, but because I chose it. This is the first brick in building a mind so strong it terrifies people. To stop seeking comfort and start seeking clarity. Not the kind of clarity that makes others comfortable, but the kind that makes you whole. But clarity alone isn't enough. Once you see through the illusions, once you recognize that comfort, applause, and external meaning are hollow, you're left with something much more daunting: responsibility. Not the kind forced upon you by others, but the kind that arises when you realize that no one is coming to rescue you. No path is pre-written. No belief is guaranteed. You are not just living, you are designing a life. That's where Nietzsche's most controversial idea strikes at the core. God is dead. Misunderstood by many, this wasn't an attack on religion. It was a funeral for borrowed certainty. He was declaring that the old systems, those we relied on to tell us who we are and what to believe, no longer hold weight in a modern, thinking mind. And when those structures collapse, what's left is a kind of spiritual nakedness. No divine blueprint, no universal script. Just you and the terrifying freedom to decide who you will become. Most people, when faced with that kind of freedom, retreat. They scramble to rebuild something familiar, to find another group, another doctrine, another should. But the few who stay in that discomfort long enough, they begin to build something entirely new. Something rooted not in fear, but in inner authority. I once spoke with a man who had spent over a decade working in a high-ranking position in government. His life looked ideal from the outside. Status, wealth, influence. But he confessed that every decision he made was based on avoiding conflict, protecting image, and playing safe. After a series of personal crises, including the death of a close friend and a public scandal that forced him into early resignation, he withdrew completely. For over a year, he lived in a remote cabin with no social media, no professional connections, no external validation. That's when, for the first time, he said he started thinking for himself. Not reacting, not pleasing, not surviving, thinking, creating, asking, what do I truly value when no one is watching? That's the birthplace of mental independence. It doesn't happen in crowds. It doesn't happen when you're surrounded by noise. It happens in solitude, when the false layers fall away, and you're left with nothing but your own voice and the courage to listen to it. Nietzsche believed that the ones who survive this inner rupture, who don't run back to the herd, begin to embody a higher state of human potential. Not because they're better, but because they're willing to live without illusions. They don't borrow meaning. They generate it. They don't follow rules. They evaluate them. They don't seek permission. They take ownership. And that's where true mental strength begins, not with rebellion, but with radical self-governance. The moment you stop needing someone to tell you what's right, and instead, you start asking yourself, what kind of life reflects the truth of who I am now? This isn't about becoming untouchable. It's about becoming undeniable, so rooted in your own values that even if the world disagrees, you remain unmoved, not out of stubbornness, but out of alignment. But here's the part most people never prepare for. Once you begin living from this place of radical self-honesty, the silence gets louder. You start to notice the gap, not just between you and the crowd, but between who you were and who you're becoming. And in that space, something begins to die. Not your worth, not your humanity, but the parts of you that once needed to be liked, the impulse to be understood, the reflex to smooth your edges, just to stay connected. These are the fragments that must be shed, not because they're bad, but because they no longer serve the person you're evolving into. This is the desert Nietzsche spoke of, the psychological wilderness, where no applause follows you, no map guides you, and no crowd walks beside you. It's the space where you must stand face to face with your own soul and ask, can I live without being validated? Can I keep walking without being seen? Most cannot. And that's why so few ever build a mind that truly terrifies others, not because it seeks domination, but because it cannot be controlled. I once met a young artist who, after years of chasing commercial success, suddenly disappeared from the industry. Her name vanished from headlines. Her fan base went silent. She told me it wasn't burnout, it was revelation. She said, "I realized my entire identity was a performance. I was producing what people wanted, not what I believed in. So I stopped everything. I needed to know if I even existed without their praise." For nearly 2 years, she created in private. No gallery shows, no press releases, no algorithm-chasing content. Just art that scared her. Work that felt too personal. And when she returned, her voice was sharper. Her themes were darker. Her presence undeniable. Some critics dismissed her as too intense, but others called her work revolutionary. She didn't become louder. She became real. That's the paradox of this transformation. The more you strip away what isn't yours, the more powerful your presence becomes. Not because you're trying to stand out, but because you've stopped trying to fit in. And yes, people will resist that. Your evolution becomes a mirror they don't want to look into. Your integrity highlights their compromise. Your refusal to perform reveals how much they still are. And they will project discomfort onto you, labeling you cold, distant, arrogant. But these aren't reflections of who you are. They're confessions of how your freedom makes them feel. Nietzsche knew this deeply. That's why he didn't just write about suffering or freedom. He lived it. He was isolated, misunderstood, even declared insane. But it was in that very isolation that his thinking reached its sharpest point. Alone, he became indivisible. So here's the question that now emerges. Are you willing to endure that same kind of silence? The rejection, the discomfort, the letting go of who you used to be? If it means becoming someone who no longer fears being real? Because that's what it takes. Not superficial strength, but deep, unwavering self-ownership. The kind that doesn't demand to be accepted. It simply exists and lets the world adjust. The deeper you walk into this path of inner sovereignty, the more you'll begin to see the quiet machinery of conformity operating all around you. It doesn't scream, it doesn't punish with force. It persuades with belonging. It seduces with normalcy. It whispers, "Don't be difficult. Don't stand out. Don't question what everyone else accepts." And it does this not out of malice, but out of inertia. This is what Nietzsche warned against. Not tyranny from above, but unconscious obedience from beside you. The collective pressure to shrink, to comply, to stay small. He called it slave morality, a psychological framework built not on genuine virtue, but on resentment. A worldview that praises meekness, not because it's noble, but because it keeps others from feeling inadequate. And this is where your strength becomes threatening, not because you impose it, but because you embody what others are still avoiding. Your refusal to follow unspoken rules is read as arrogance. Your decisiveness is mistaken for coldness. Your clarity feels like a personal attack to those still living by borrowed beliefs. But none of this is about you. It's about what you reflect back. I once worked with a man who had risen to a leadership role in a major corporation. He was respected, well compensated, and seen as a model of success. But when he began questioning the company's values, when he stopped nodding in meetings just to maintain harmony, he noticed the atmosphere shift. Invitations dwindled. Colleagues withdrew. The praise turned into polite distance. One day he told me, "I didn't say anything radical. I just stopped pretending." And apparently, that was enough to make people uncomfortable. That's the silent penalty for authenticity. Isolation without confrontation. You won't always be attacked. You'll simply be excluded. Not because you're wrong, but because you're not playing along. And that's when the real test begins. Will you mold yourself back into something acceptable just to be welcomed again? Or will you choose to remain whole, even if it means walking alone? Because this journey doesn't reward imitation. It demands originality. And in a world addicted to repetition, your uniqueness becomes a disruption. Not because you seek to dominate, but because you refuse to be edited. Nietzsche understood that this level of self-possession comes at a cost. You may lose comfort, approval, connection. But what you gain is something infinitely more valuable: the right to stand in your own truth without compromise, to think without censorship, to speak without rehearsing, to live without seeking permission. And in doing so, you become a different kind of presence. Not louder, but sharper. Not aggressive, but grounded. Not perfect, but real. And in a world terrified of authenticity, that is perhaps the most unsettling power of all. By now, you've probably started to sense it. The quiet cost of becoming someone who cannot be controlled, not just by systems, but by praise, pressure, or expectation. You're no longer operating from reaction. You're no longer asking what's acceptable. You're asking what's authentic. And that shift doesn't just change how you think, it changes how others experience you. Because when you no longer need approval to feel valid, you become unpredictable to the crowd. You speak with weight. You move with intention. You're not loud, but your silence says more than their noise ever could. And that's what disturbs people. Not that you're extreme, but that you're free. Freedom like this doesn't wear a costume. It doesn't apologize. And it doesn't fit in. That's why, as Nietzsche believed, the world will always try to tame it, not through open attack, but subtle erosion. They'll call you cold when you protect your peace, arrogant when you assert your truth, unstable when you walk away from what's familiar but false. Let me share something personal with you. A woman once wrote to me, after watching a video on this channel, Psychology Insights. She had been in a long-term relationship for 8 years, comfortable, steady, but quietly suffocating. Her partner didn't mistreat her, but he also didn't respect her growth. Every time she spoke up about wanting more, from life, from herself, she was met with condescension or silence. One day, she said, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. I had become so agreeable, I disappeared. So she left. No drama, no explanation. Just a quiet departure back to herself. It cost her friends. It cost her reputation. But it gave her something she hadn't felt in years: self-respect. Now she lives in a small town, writes full-time, and says, I finally feel like a human being, not a performance. That's the power of reclaiming your mind. You stop living a version of yourself created for someone else's comfort, and start living the truth, even when it costs you everything false. And I want to ask you directly, right here on Psychology Insights, what part of yourself have you been keeping small just to make others feel safe? What truth have you been silencing because it didn't fit into their version of you? Write it in the comments. I want to hear it, not just for me, but for you. Because the moment you name your truth, you begin to reclaim it. And when one person speaks with clarity, it gives others permission to stop whispering their own lives. This community, this channel, is not for those trying to blend in. It's for those who are done shrinking, done performing, done apologizing for being intense, deep, clear, or different. So, if your mind makes people uncomfortable, good. Maybe that discomfort is exactly what they needed to wake up. If you've stayed with me until now, then you already know this wasn't just another video about mindset. This was a confrontation, a mirror, a challenge. What we explored here wasn't comfort or cliché advice. It was Nietzsche's raw, unfiltered truth. That in order to become someone unshakable, you must be willing to walk through isolation, rejection, and internal collapse. You must strip away every borrowed belief and rebuild yourself, not from applause, but from alignment, from chaos, yes, but also from conscious choice. The world doesn't fear noise, it fears clarity. And when your mind becomes clear, when you no longer seek validation, when you stop apologizing for your vision, you begin to unsettle the world around you. Not because you try to, but because your presence exposes everything that isn't real. So here's what I want to leave you with, right here on Channel Psychology Insights. Think about the version of yourself you've been shrinking just to be tolerated, the opinions you've silenced, the instincts you've ignored. Now ask yourself, what would my life look like if I stopped editing who I am to make others comfortable? And more importantly, what part of me am I ready to reclaim, starting today? Let me know in the comments. Speak your truth, not to be agreed with, but to be free. And if this message struck a nerve, if it stirred something deep inside you that refuses to be quiet any longer, then don't stop here. Subscribe to X and be part of this space we're building, where growth is sacred, truth is respected, and silence is never mistaken for weakness. Because this isn't just about building a strong mind. It's about becoming someone so real, so whole, so free, that the world no longer knows how to put you in a box. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what the world needs.